So good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Close Oppenheimer, the president of the Salisbury Forum. We're really pleased to have you with us tonight. For those of you who aren't familiar with the forum, we're based in Salisbury, Connecticut, in the northwest part of the state. We host nationally recognized speakers in free public forums. To learn about upcoming events, please go to our homepage and join our email list. You can also follow us on Facebook. If you or your friends miss one of our talks, the videos will be available on our website within a couple of days. It will allow you to watch them at home whenever you have a chance. There's some really great talks on our website, so I encourage you to check them out if you have the time. Go to www.salisburyforum.org and look under videos. Since our talks are free, like everyone, we're extremely grateful for any and all donations. You can make one easily by clicking on the donate button on our homepage. And you can also, just send us a check. And so we will have a Q&A period at the end of the talk tonight. Please don't use the chat feature. Instead, click on the Q&A button in the bottom center of your screen to type in any questions you may have. On Friday, June 25th, our next speaker will be Catherine Frigie. She'll be speaking about the gene editing technology CRISPR's role in fighting against known and new infectious diseases. Given the year we've just had dealing with an infectious disease, I think you won't want to miss her talk, and it's amazing technology that she's working with. We're so happy to welcome Stephen Johnson to the Salisbury Forum tonight. You may be familiar with his 6-part documentary series and related book, How We Got to Now, which tells the fascinating stories behind the remarkable ideas that have made modern life possible. I just love the book. I hope you will get it and read it if you haven't already. To give you an idea of the breadth of his writings, they've influenced everything from cutting-edge ideas in urban planning to the battle against 21st century terrorism. Wonderland, How Play Made the Modern World, revolves around the creative power of play and delight, ideas and innovations that set into motion many momentous changes in science, technology, politics, and society. Overall, he's published 13 books, written for more publications than I have time to list, and hosted the podcast American Innovations. The topic of his new book and 4-part PBS series is Extra Life, A Short History of Living Longer. It premiered on May 11th. The last episode will be next Tuesday, June 1st at 8 o'clock. You can stream it via pbs.org or on the PBS video app. And I just found out that Obama just tweeted out a plug for Stephen's Time magazine adaptation of Extra Life to his 130 million followers, saying, quote, "At a time when so much of the debate around vaccinations and other public health measures has been politicized, this article offers a useful reminder of the role of modern science in fundamentally transforming all our lives." It's quite a plug. That book and his 2020 book, Enemy of All Mankind, a true story of piracy, power, and history's first global manhunt, which has just been released in paperback, will be available at Oblong Books and Music in Millerton, New York. Give them a call to order your copy, and they'll include a signed bookplate with your purchase. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Stephen Johnson to our forum tonight.
Thanks, everyone. Delighted to be here. I wish that this were in person. That part of the world is very special to me. My wife and I were married in the Berkshires many, many years ago. And so I'm sorry that I'm not actually joining you all and signing books in person. But I'm delighted to have this opportunity. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Lee DeBoer, for bringing me to the forum. I'm really honored to be here. So I want to talk about this project. It is a true kind of multi-platform project that I've been working on for more than 4 years now. And it's all just kind of emerged in public in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So it's a pretty exciting time. As you heard, the full title is Extra Life, A Short History of Living Longer. And it has as its central focus the really extraordinary story of human life expectancy and the transformation of it over the last 100 years or so, but the scope of the book goes back much further than that. I'll get a little bit to the specifics of what happened to life expectancy and walk you through the kind of demographic revolution that's behind that. But I want to talk a little bit at the outset about how this project came into being, how I first started thinking about this idea. And it really dates back to a book that I wrote around 15 or 16 years ago, which is a book perhaps some of you have read called The Ghost Map. And The Ghost Map was a story about another terrible disease outbreak in London in the 1850s, an outbreak of cholera that was one of the great killers of the 19th century, particularly in big cities like London or New York or Paris. And The Ghost Map was kind of a medical thriller in a way, a detective story, because at its heart, it was a story about an idea that emerged out of the chaos and terror of a terrible urban outbreak that led to a remarkable leap forward in public health and our understanding of how disease spreads through society. At the time, in the mid 1850s, cholera was believed to have been a disease that was caused by people breathing in noxious fumes. A lot of people thought it was really a disease caused by bad smells. This was known as the miasma theory of the day. And on some level, this was an understandable assumption because at that point, London was probably the smelliest city the world had ever seen. You had no real waste removal systems and lots of animals living in the streets. But we now know that cholera is actually a disease caused by contaminated drinking water. And so it was a period where all the medical establishment really was convinced that the culprit was somewhere where it was not. They were trying to purify the air when what they really needed to do was to clean the water. And in the story of The Ghost Map, a character named John Snow, who was a local doctor in Soho, ends up solving the mystery of cholera, proving that it's in the water through an investigation that he does heroically in the middle of this outbreak in the London neighborhood of Soho. He tracks down all the cases of people who've fallen ill from this disease. 10% of the neighborhood died over the course of about a 3-week period. And he creates a map, and the map shows where people are dying in the neighborhood. And when you look at the map, you see this very clear drinking well in the middle where people would get their drinking water with a pump, where people were getting sick. And he sees that there's a cluster of death around this pump at the center of Soho. And he goes to the authorities and he convinces them, with the help of a few other people, that the water is the problem. And slowly the medical establishment comes around to this idea, and a number of amazing engineering projects are begun to purify the drinking water of London. The London sewers are built. And by 1866, cholera is gone from London for good, never to return again in an outbreak. So that was a story that was a story about progress, really. It was a story about how fundamental change happens in society. And it had a kind of a mystery to it, which made it compelling as a narrative, I think. But I also wrote that book to remind people of what life was like not that long ago, that 150 years ago, you could have a sip of water, in your home, and in 48 hours you could be dead of cholera. That was just the reality of life for people living in big cities 150, 170 years ago. And it was important, I think, to remind ourselves at that point of that kind of progress, that we're capable of solving problems like that. And cholera has been greatly reduced. It's still a problem in some parts of the world, but it's not nearly the looming constant threat that it was in the 19th century, even in the poorer countries of the world. So I was interested in developing that theme. In some sense, Ghost Map was a love song to public health and using data to fight disease. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, I started to think that maybe there was another similar project that I could do that would take on an even more expansive or ambitious theme. And the idea was effectively to write a history book, where the protagonist or the central focus of the book was not going to be a military conflict or a great leader or a civil rights movement, but rather a number that stood in for thousands of incremental but important changes made in society that improved society, that made life longer for people. And that number was life expectancy. How long, that fundamental measure of the health of a society. How long do the people living in that society have to live? Like, what are their expectations in terms of how long their lives will be? Will they live to see their grandchildren? Will they live to see their great-grandchildren? And I knew that the number had grown dramatically over the last century or so. And I'll get into more of the details about this, but effectively, average life expectancy at birth doubled over the last 100 years since the end of the Spanish flu, the great influenza around 1920, when the Spanish flu came to an end. So I thought, that's a powerful kind of framing, this idea that we doubled the average lifespan of human beings globally around the world over a 100-year period, just in 3 or 4 generations. And I thought it'd be interesting to not only remind people of that kind of progress, but also to try and dive into the question of how it really happened. What were the main forces that drove that incredible story? And I thought, as I was contemplating this 4 years ago, I thought, well, this will be interesting, and maybe we could do another TV series. I think, perhaps PBS would be interested in this kind of story. It's an interesting science story. It's an interesting history story. And at the time, sitting there in 2017, I thought, well, it'll take me 2 or 3 years to put this together. And so it will come out in 2020. And 2020 will be the 100-year anniversary of the end of the Spanish flu, the last point at which global life expectancy took a serious turn downwards. After that point, basically starting around 1920, globally life expectancy continually rises for the next 100 years. Now, it goes backwards a little bit in the United States in the last 3 or 4 years, which we can talk about. But as a global story, it's just an upward march that entire period. And so I thought, if the book and the show were to come out in the year 2020 or 2021, that there would be a nice kind of historical symmetry to this project, in the sense that you would have this 100-year anniversary of the end of the Spanish flu. It turned out that 2020 and 2021 had a completely different significance that I had not anticipated, which was obviously the COVID crisis. And I'd actually written most of the book in 2019, before COVID started. But it had taken us a lot of time and energy and a lot of wasted meetings trying to get the television side of this in development. PBS wanted to do it, but I don't need to bore you with these details, but they always require additional funding from other sources. And for some reason, it was complicated to find funding for this television show, even though it seemed like a great idea to me. And then suddenly we found ourselves in March and April of last year, and COVID is transforming the world at this extraordinary pace, changing all of our lives, triggering probably the single largest, most momentous, coordinated global change in behavior that we've ever seen in the history of our species. And we realized that we were sitting on a story about the importance of public health, about the importance of data and analyzing outbreaks, about the importance of vaccines and mass vaccination campaigns. All of these things that I've been researching for the last 3 years suddenly were front page news everywhere. And as tragic as COVID was, it helped us, and in the end, help get the show into production. And we ended up making a program, if folks get to see it, or if you've seen some of the episodes, what we tried to do was to, in a sense, weave the history of the last 100 or 200 years of developments in health and medicine and public health, tell those historical stories in the context of the present crisis. And so we have an opening episode on vaccines, and that goes back in the past hundreds of years to tell the early story of vaccination, which I'll tell you about a little bit today. And then we'll go from a story from 200 years ago to me having a conversation with Dr. Fauci And so ultimately, what both the book and particularly the PBS series ended up being, in my mind at least, was a kind of 200-year history of right now, really, and an attempt to understand the deep forces that led us to this particular moment in time, and hopefully we'll have some lessons to learn about how we get out of this crisis and how we prevent the next one from happening. So COVID changed the whole project. I rewrote a bunch of the book to reflect the reality of COVID. We had an additional challenge in making the series, in the sense that we shot it all in October, November, December, and January of 2020 and 2021. I have a wonderful co-host for the series, a guy named David Olashoga, who's a British Nigerian historian who's fantastic. Some of you may have seen him on other PBS shows that he hosts for the BBC. And David was in London and I was in the US. And so we had enormous logistical problems just getting it made. But in the end, we got it done. And I'm very proud of what we produced. What this project is ultimately trying to do is to remind us of the magnitude of this change. If you go back and look at the numbers, we don't know exactly what global life expectancy was 100 years ago, 120 years ago, but best estimates suggest that it was somewhere in the high 30s, somewhere between 35 and 40. In the United States, it was around 41 or 42 at the height of the Spanish flu. Today, in the United States, it's somewhere around 78, and globally, life expectancy is 72.6 is the last official measure of it. And so we really, truly have, on a global level, doubled our lifespan over this period. And to me, I think that should stand as the single most impressive achievement of the human race, that we've been able to add so much life to our life and reduce so much needless death. It's really an exceptional thing. But we tend to not focus on it for a couple of reasons. The first is that success and progress in health is measured, in a sense, by non-events, right? When we invent new technologies like a smartphone or a television, we can see those objects. They exist in the world. We can point to the smartphone and say, this is progress. But progress in health, the most fundamental measure of it are the things that didn't happen. The smallpox infection that didn't kill you when you were 2 because the smallpox vaccine had been invented. Like the cholera outbreak that didn't kill you when you were 10 because your drinking water is now chlorinated. The car accident that turned out to just be a minor fender bender because someone invented seatbelts and crumple zones on your car. And so we don't think about those achievements because those are events that didn't happen. There's a reason we don't think about them. They're non-events. And so we forget how much progress has been made. We forget how dangerous life was like in the past. And we don't necessarily pay attention to the big drivers of change and progress in society. And we get distracted by all the kind of surface fluctuations and the new technology and the shiny objects. And we miss the things that actually are keeping us alive and keeping us healthy and keeping us safe. And that's one of the things about a pandemic that changes everything, is that suddenly we realize that there's this whole infrastructure that's been out there protecting us, trying to keep us safe, monitoring disease outbreaks, manufacturing vaccines, testing vaccines, all that infrastructure we rarely think about. And suddenly it's the single most important thing happening in the world. And so it's an opportunity for us, I think, to look at that world of health and really appreciate how much progress we have made despite the pandemic that we're wrestling with today. Now, there are a couple of interesting things about life expectancy that some of which I did not know when I went into this project, and some of which I did. I think one of the things that's been most surprising to me since I've been talking about this in public is that there is a common response that kind of a subset of people will have when they hear me talk about the doubling of life expectancy over the last century. And that response is to say, that's just a statistical sleight of hand. It's just about infant mortality being dramatically reduced. people who make it past the first few days of life are living the same length of life that they used to 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And I'm here to tell you that that is not true. But there are two things to keep in mind in understanding why it's not true. The first thing is that the reductions in childhood mortality, infant mortality, but also deaths among children, is part of this story. And it's an important part of the story, and it's really one of the most miraculous parts of the story, I think. Until about 100 years ago, average childhood mortality around the world was 40%. Just think about that number for a second. That meant if you had 5 children, on average, 2 of them would die before reaching adulthood. That was the global number. Now, over the last century, globally, we've taken that number of 40% childhood mortality and reduced it to 4. And in the United States, that number is less than 1%. So we've reduced it by a factor of 10 over that period. And that has enabled overall life expectancy to rise as a number because so many children are not dying at 5 months or at 5 years or at 10 years, but living on to have their own children and grow up to be adults. So the childhood mortality story is a big part of this. And that, I think, is something we should not take lightly, right? I mean, it's an amazing achievement. It is astonishing, and I'll talk about this a bit more in some of the specific stories I want to share with you, but you know, until the 20th century, childhood was an incredibly dangerous time to be alive. It was, in fact, the most dangerous period of your life until you reached your 60s or your 70s. It was just a remarkably perilous period of your life. And think about what that means for our sense of what childhood is. Think of what that means for our sense of what it is to be a parent. I mean, if you read almost every 19th century novel, you know that children are dying in those narratives all the time. It's a major kind of plot point because it was so central to people's just ordinary experience that they would lose children at that astonishingly, tragically high rate. So that's part of the story. But the other part of the story is that we were also living longer at the end of our lives. So the best way to explain this is in 1850 in England, overall life expectancy is something like 45. But if you made it to the age of 20, you would have a life expectancy of 60. The average person who made it to adulthood would live to 60. Now today, the average person in England who makes it to the age of 20 can expect to live until 85 or a little bit longer than that, actually. So we've added at the end of life, during the adult period of life, we've added 25 years of life in that 150-year period. 25 years, that's a generation. That is the difference between meeting your grandchildren and meeting your great-grandchildren. So we are pushing the boundaries both at the beginnings of life and at the ends of life. And the progress that's coming now is actually coming mostly from end of life extension. Centenarians, people who live to be 100 or more, are projected to be the fastest growing age demographic in the United States in the coming years. So that is an enormous change as well. I mean, it was very unusual to live to 100 just 50 years ago. Now it's increasingly common. So it's not just a statistical sleight of hand. It's not just about infant mortality. It's a much bigger trend than that. The other thing that I found fascinating in going through this research is that there is very little change in the average human lifespan until around 1750 or 1800, as far as we know. There have been fascinating studies, which I talk about in the book at length in a long introduction that goes into this, looking at how long hunter-gatherers lived in the period before the rise of agriculture. So looking back 10,000 years, 20,000 years. And we've started to analyze this and understand this both through analyzing present day hunter-gatherer societies and also looking through analyzing the bones of people who lived 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago and try to estimate how old they were at death. And what we believe, the best estimates now is that life expectancy for human beings was more or less constant at 35, with 40% childhood mortality, from hunter-gatherer times all the way through until around 1800 in Europe. So no matter where you were in the world, you could be in the richest society in the world, you could be in the poorest society of the world, you could be a hunter-gatherer, you could be the king of England, your life expectancy at birth was going to be about 35, and 2 out of 5 of your kids were going to die. And what that meant was, interestingly, while there was no real change in overall your odds of living a long life, there was also no health inequality. So you had tremendous wealth inequality during that period. If you think about what Europe was like in 1600, I mean, you had fantastically wealthy, members of the royalty, but you had paupers. But in terms of health, they had no advantage. The wealthiest people had no advantage over the poorest members of society. Until around 1750, 1800, when for the first time, a subset of the population in Europe and in the United States starts to grow older in a kind of steady way. And you see these average life expectancies extend, people living longer and longer among the elites, among the wealthiest members of society. And this is a transformative moment in our history. So for the first time, you see a sustained takeoff, what's sometimes called the Great Escape, of people living longer and longer lives on average, children being less likely to die at a young age. But it's only happening among the wealthiest members of society. And during that period, which is really the dawn of the industrial age, among the less wealthy members of society, among the working class, you see death rates actually get higher. And by the middle of the 1850s, in a city like Liverpool, which had rapidly industrialized in that period, life expectancy declined for the overall population down to 25 years, with 50% of the kids dying before they reached adulthood. And so you see this gap opening up between the richest and the poor. And so at that moment of progress, a moment of, whoa, it's possible to live longer, this is something we've never done before in our history, is also the moment in which a new kind of inequality emerges. And that's the kind of the mixed blessing of the story. Now, the good news is lifespan inequality has been decreasing over the last 50 years, particularly on a global scale. Probably the peak moment of inequality between the industrialized world and what we now call the global south, the developing world, as we sometimes used to call it. The peak moment of inequality was about 1950. And there's a huge gap. Parts of Europe were living to 70 years on average, and parts of India, Africa, were still living 25 years on average. So there was a massive gap, but that gap has narrowed dramatically. And now, today, you see a difference of only something like 10 years between the United States and India, for instance. China has obviously made tremendous progress. So we are narrowing that gap. It's not finished, and there's a lot of work to be done on that, but we have made a lot of progress over the last 50 years. And that's part of the importance of this project, is you want to look at the overall number, but you also want to look at the distribution. How fairly are the advances in health that are driving this being distributed among people, and how can we make sure that they're more equitably distributed? That's a big theme of the project, something we talked about a lot on the episode of the PBS series that aired last night, which is still available to see, as Mary mentioned. So the question then that really animated me in this project, once I got the overall framing, was trying to decide and determine what were the real factors that drove all this change. I mean, on some level, this book is a study in understanding how momentous change happens in society. Where does it really, like enduring fundamental change, how does it happen? Where does it come from? And the book is divided up into about 8 chapters where I look at these, kind of the major drivers. There's a chapter on vaccines, there's a chapter on data, there's a chapter on antibiotics, and I'll talk about some of this in detail. But my initial idea had been, perhaps we could really do this quantitatively and really determine, exactly how many extra days of life did we get from, the polio vaccine on average? How many days of life did we get from chlorinated drinking water? And I had this kind of early statistical dream that you could do that kind of calculations. And it turns out you really can't, because it's very complicated and you can't run a simulation and determine how long people would have lived had not the smallpox vaccine been invented and so on. So that grew more difficult. But roughly, I tried to divide it up into, big factors, orders of magnitude factors. What were the inventions that probably saved billions of lives? What were the ones that saved hundreds of millions of lives, and so on? And there are a couple of lessons that I've learned from that exploration. And the first one is really there embedded in the story of vaccines. And that is that these breakthroughs are global by nature, and they require global collaboration to really have an impact. And the story of vaccines is a beautiful example of this. So, those of you who know a little bit of history of medicine and health have probably heard the famous story about Edward Jenner, who invented the smallpox vaccine in 1796. And that's one of the early milestones in health, the first functioning vaccine treating or protecting us against one of the great terrifying killers in human history, smallpox, which dates back to the ancient Egyptians and was a major cause of mortality in Europe in the 1700s. Just a number of members of European royal families who died of smallpox, particularly at a young age, is just staggering. In the book, I have a list of all the, it's like 20 members of European royalty during that period who were killed by smallpox. It didn't matter if you were the richest person in the world, this virus was just as deadly for your offspring or for you as it would be for the poorest person in society. So the smallpox vaccine was a major breakthrough. But the story that is conventionally told about it focuses on this one rural doctor, Edward Jenner, who comes up with this idea. But in fact, there was another idea that actually had been developing for hundreds of years that predated smallpox vaccines. And that was this technology of variolation. And variolation was basically to take a little bit of an infected pustule from someone who had smallpox and scrape a little bit of it off and give someone deliberately, a child normally, a very small, limited infection with smallpox. And they would actually contract a mild version of the disease and then recover from it after a couple of days. And then they would have immunity for life from the smallpox virus. This was a very dangerous procedure by our modern standards. 2% of the people died through the procedure of variolation. But the odds of getting smallpox and dying were so much worse that it was actually the smart thing to do, the healthy thing to do if you wanted to increase your odds of living a long and healthy life by building that immunity. So it shared the same property as vaccination of triggering this immune response to protect us against a future infection. But it was much more deadly than vaccines. And that technique had been around for centuries. It was actually not developed in the West. It was not developed by Enlightenment science. It was something that originated, we think, multiple times in different parts of the world, in China, India, and Africa. It actually came to the colonies, the pre-United States colonies, via the slave trade, because these enslaved Africans had been inoculated using variolation against smallpox in their cultures back in Africa. And Europeans and Americans learned about this tradition through the migration of the idea, through the slave trade, through other contact between the West and East during that period. And it was that idea that was already in the mind of Edward Jenner when he came up with the idea of the smallpox vaccine itself, which instead of using the smallpox virus, used a cowpox virus, a less deadly but related virus, as a way of triggering that immune response. Jenner had been variolated himself as a child, and he had practiced variolation for decades. And so when we ask ourselves the question of where did this idea come from? The truth is it was a global idea from the beginning. It was an idea that had to move around from country to country and slowly coalesce into something that was an even bigger breakthrough in Jenner's final idea. And I think that global emphasis is so important because really, to me, the most powerful example of our extraordinary triumph of health in this whole long march of living longer is the extraordinary campaign to eradicate smallpox, which began in the 1960s and culminated in the mid-1970s with an extraordinary mass vaccination campaign through India and parts of Africa. And it's just, there were hundreds of thousands of field workers coordinated by the WHO, vaccinating people, inventing new technologies to vaccinate people, trying to track down these outbreaks of smallpox, which eventually coalesced in the very last case of naturally occurring smallpox in the world being identified in Bangladesh, on Bola Island in Bangladesh, a little girl who'd come down with smallpox. And they vaccinated the people around her in what they called a ring vaccination technique. And that she was the last person to contract smallpox in the wild in history. Hundreds of millions of people had died over the preceding century or two of smallpox. And then after October of 1975, there were none. And to me, that global effort, which involved all these people and all these organizations, is one of our most profound achievements as a species. And yet, when you think about it, every kid knows that we landed a man on the moon in that period, but how many school kids know that we eradicated smallpox? Why don't we celebrate that story as much as we celebrate the story of the moon landing? It seems to me that in terms of a material effect on our lives, smallpox eradication was actually a bigger deal. And it's a story not of competition with some other nation as in the space race, but a story of nations coming together to collectively solve a huge problem. It was just unimaginable that we could do something as dramatic as wipe a virus off the entire face of the earth back then. So that's, to me, the kind of the arc of variolation all the way to the eradication of smallpox is one of the most important ones that runs through the book. And that emphasis on globalization is really, and global collaboration is really important to me. One of the other things that I think is very interesting is that other than vaccines, medicine is really a late arriver to the scene of improvements in human health. When you go back and look at it, it seems as though the experience of kind of going to the doctor, going to the hospital to cure yourself of some disease that you've come down with, you've gotten sick, you've gotten an infection, you go to the pharmacy to get a pill to make you feel better, or some kind of potion. That experience, which is a big part of contemporary life, is actually a relatively recent development in terms of it having a positive impact. We think that, all told, medical drugs were probably not beneficial to human beings in terms of keeping them alive and healthy until the invention of antibiotics with the invention of penicillin, which is, penicillin is kind of created between 1928 and 1942. Up until that point, there were just ridiculous snake oil quack cures that were on the market. There's a kind of a fun section of the book where I go back and look at a drug catalog from the Parke-Davis Company from 1908, I think it is. And if you just read through the descriptions of all these medications, it's shocking. It's like, would you like some arsenic with that? Here's some mercury to treat your common cold. And bloodletting was a common practice into the 20th century. So medicine actually took a long time to make a difference, and yet life expectancy actually started to improve in countries like the United States and in Europe for the entire population. Well before that, you start to see this really beautiful democratic increase in lifespan that begins to happen in the very end of the 19th century and continues rapidly up until World War II, just interrupted by the outbreak of the Spanish flu. And so if medicine isn't driving that, what is driving that? And it turns out that it's really more about infrastructure. It's about things like clean drinking water and the story that we began with, the ghost map. People realizing that we need to do things like have basic sanitation reform. We need to build sewers. We need to separate out the waste from the drinking water. We need to wash our hands. All of these basic things that were not really understood until the second half of the 19th century were put in place not by doctors, physicians, and hospitals, but by people building the kind of the basic pipes that support civilization or modern civilization. And that was a big part of the process. So medicine is actually kind of a surprisingly late arrival on the scene. And the other thing that I think is really important in understanding how this kind of change happens is that it's not always driven exclusively by science. So this is very much, I want to make it clear, this book and this show is a celebration of science at a point where we have these dangerous anti-science movements in society. And many of the heroes in this story are scientists, and they are an important part of this. And I think we have anti-science movements in part because we aren't telling these stories. We aren't celebrating things like the eradication of smallpox. But I also had spent a lot of time trying to emphasize the fact that science on its own is not enough. Because a scientific idea, a medical idea that happens in the lab doesn't affect change on its own. you need to get that idea into circulation. You need to get people to adopt it. You need to get people to embrace it, to understand it. And so when we're trying to understand how this kind of momentous change happens, we really have to also focus on the people who push these ideas. And those people are often not scientists. They're often activists and social reformers and sometimes politicians. Sometimes they're just public figures. And Charles Dickens was a huge advocate for vaccination in the 19th century. He was a novelist, but he used his platform that he had by being such a famous novelist and his magazine, Household Words, that he published to write about vaccination and encourage people to get vaccinated. Probably my favorite example of the importance of social movements and engagement in driving change is the story of pasteurization. So it may seem strange to us to contemplate this, but in the middle of the 19th century, milk was, particularly in a big city like New York, where I'm talking to you from, milk was in many cases a deadly poison. There were countless, particularly early childhood deaths from milk, from contaminated milk. That Manhattan had grown so quickly, it wasn't possible to have cows within near proximity to the downtown areas. There was no mechanical refrigeration at that point, so milk would spoil, and the milk could carry tuberculosis, so people could get tuberculosis from the milk. There was just a whole host of ailments, many of them fatal, that you could drink from contaminated milk supplies. And New York was like Liverpool at that point. In 1850 in New York, 60% of all deaths were children, and milk was a major culprit. Now, this is the point where you would probably think, okay, well, that's great. We solved this with chemistry, right? Louis Pasteur, the famous French chemist, invents the technique of pasteurization in 1865. And that is a wonderful technique for making milk safe. And his name is emblazoned on every milk carton you'll buy practically as a mark of his achievement. But here's the thing about pasteurization. Pasteur comes up with this technique in 1865. We don't have pasteurized milk on the shelves in grocery stores in the United States until around 1915. That's 50 years it takes to go from a scientific breakthrough to something that actually matters in the real world. And that's because science on its own is not enough. It turned out that there was a major, in a sense, political movement to get pasteurized milk to turn it into the standard. One of the great characters in the book is this guy, Nathan Strauss, who was the co-owner with his brother of the Macy's department store in New York. He was a department store magnate. And somehow in his career, he got obsessed with this idea of helping the urban poor with these terrible mortality rates that he was seeing by convincing them to drink pasteurized milk. And so he set up what were called milk depots all around the city, where he sold pasteurized milk at below cost, trying to convince people that it was not only safe to drink, but actually tasted good, which a lot of consumers were wary of. And he held big rallies. There was this whole kind of, pasteurized milk movement that developed in the second half of the 19th century, spearheaded by Strauss and a few other people. And eventually, slowly over time, the milk industry came around and a bunch of laws were passed mandating that milk be pasteurized. And by the end of that process, the cities became much safer because of that. And so when we look back at these kinds of changes, I think it's important to recognize that, in some ways they're closer to things like the fight for the abolition of slavery or universal suffrage. There's scientific advances that had to be pushed into circulation by activists and evangelists and people willing to fight for these ideas. And so it's not just about the science, it's also about struggle on some level. And it's also crucially about collaboration and networks of people, and not about lone geniuses. And here the penicillin story, I think, is the ultimate emblem of this. Again, just like Edward Jenner, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with a very famous story about the origins of penicillin. The first real magic bullet drug that revolutionized medicine and opened the doors to a whole new wave of medical innovation in terms of drugs that really do treat illnesses and infection. A milestone for sure. The classic story is that penicillin is discovered by Alexander Fleming in London in 1928. And the story goes that Fleming had a Petri dish that was filled with a staph bacteria. And he went on a vacation and left it sitting on his desk and came back 2 weeks later, and a little penicillin mold spore had dropped into the Petri dish and reproduced itself. And it seemed to be repelling, actually killing the bacteria in the dish. And so Fleming realizes that the penicillin mold is emitting some kind of substance, which is what he actually calls penicillin. And he realizes he's stumbled across the Holy Grail. It's a bacteria killer. This will revolutionize our ability to fight infections. And sure enough, that was an important breakthrough. And yet, at the same time, it was only the first step, because Fleming actually doesn't really do that much with penicillin after that point. He really kind of abandons his great discovery. And the problem with penicillin was not just discovering it. The real challenge with penicillin was seeing if you could make enough of it to actually treat one human being, much less millions of human beings around the world. And that was a much more complicated challenge that Fleming really didn't play a role in. And we like the story of Fleming, I think, because he's kind of the patron saint of anybody who keeps a messy desk at work, right? You think, if I just don't tidy up here, I will someday win a Nobel Prize, like Alexander Fleming did. But in fact, that the story of how penicillin got turned into a true wonder drug that made a difference, it involves far more characters. And I think it's actually a better story because it's a thrilling story. It's told in the book and in the episode that aired 2 weeks ago about medical drugs. Basically, a bunch of Oxford doctors and scientists get a hold of Fleming's medicine. Only by this point, it's 1940. And they realize that as World War II is erupting around the world, that this could be a true bacteria killer, could be a massive advantage for the Allies in World War II, because so many people in the military are dying of infections, as has been always the case in the history of human military conflict. They're dying of infections back in the hospitals, not dying from their original wounds. And so if you can develop a wonder drug that can treat those infections and keep those soldiers alive, you're going to have a major advantage. But it's incredibly difficult to scale this drug up. And they try and do a little bit of it in London, but eventually the Blitz forces them to leave, and they come to the United States under the supervision of both the US military and the US Department of Agriculture, which is kind of interesting because it's involving molds, which grow in the soil. So the agriculture people know a lot about that. And eventually they enlist the services of Pfizer. And over time, they finally figure out this technique for making enough of the penicillin substance so that by the time soldiers land on the beaches in Normandy on D-Day, they're carrying with their weapons penicillin packets. And it's an important part of the story of how we won the war. Now, this is a great example to me of our strange sense of emphasis in the stories we tell ourselves about our history, right? What if I asked you, name the story of a great multinational collaboration with brilliant scientists coming together to solve a really complicated scientific problem that ended up being crucial in helping the Allies win World War II? The answer, I guarantee you, almost always will be the Manhattan Project, the building of the atomic bomb. But the story of penicillin is equally thrilling, equally important. And what we got out of it was not a weapon of mass destruction, but a magic bullet that saved probably billions of lives since antibiotics got into circulation over the last 70 years. So it seems to me, and this is really ultimately what this book and this show are trying to do, is that on some level we've been ignoring some of the important heroes that we should be telling ourselves the stories of, and we should be teaching in our schools. There's a big education component to this whole project as well. We should be celebrating the achievements of smallpox eradication. We should be celebrating that network of brilliant scientists who brought us penicillin. We should be looking at that upward march of life expectancy and saying, that was amazing. We did that. Who did that? And what were the institutions and the forces and the disciplines that made that possible? And let's learn from them and try and apply that problem solving to future emerging threats that we're going to face, including the pandemic we're in right now. But I'll leave you just with one last thought, and then I'd love to answer any questions you have. Mary will come back on and can field them. And And that is just to note that while this is an optimistic story, obviously, and I hope you can hear my enthusiasm for trying to tell it, no change that momentous is ever purely positive in its effects. And life expectancy is no different in that sense. If you rewound the clock 100 years back to that point when global life expectancy around the Spanish flu was in the high 30s, there were about 2 billion people on the planet. Today, there are just under 8 billion people on the planet. And that, sometimes you'll hear people talking about that runaway population growth as a product of people having too many babies, but that's not what's driving. People are having fewer babies per capita than ever. In fact, as you may have seen in the New York Times, there was just a story about the future threat of population decline in parts of the world. The reason we went from 2 billion to 8 billion is not that people were having more babies, it's that people stopped dying. And that population growth is a direct consequence of the increase in the average human lifespan over that period. Children that didn't die, that went on to become adults and have their own children, and then lived long enough to be grandparents or great-grandparents, so that the generations stacked up. And when you do that, when you reduce mortality at that rate, you're going to go from 2 billion to 8 billion people in a really short amount of time. And the paradox of all of this, which is something I think we don't think about quite enough, is that we would not have the climate crisis the way we do today had we not solved all of these public health problems and medicine problems over the last 100 years. If we kept the population at 2 billion, we really wouldn't be facing the major crisis we have with climate change, even if we continue to industrialize over that period, because there just won't be enough people out there emitting carbon into the atmosphere to make a big difference. So in a very strange way, climate change is actually the result of 2 macro trends: industrialization, which outputs all this carbon in the atmosphere, and public health improvements in longevity, which increase the population from 2 billion to 8 billion. And so, in a sense, climate change is now creating a whole host of new threats, which may end up turning back the clock in terms of our lifespan. We may see tremendous disruptions in climate and drought that we're seeing, for instance, right now in the American West, and mass migrations that will be forced. We don't know. If life expectancy starts going backwards, climate change will probably be the ultimate culprit there. So these things are all bound up in each other in a really complicated way, and it's not a uniformly positive story. But I do think that it is the most important story. It is the story of the way in which our lives have been the most significantly transformed over this period. And the metaphor I always use is, if a newspaper came out once a century, what would the banner headline be? And I think in our case, looking back over the last century, it would have to be the fact that we got this extraordinary amount of extra life all around the world. That to me is the real headline of the last century.
Okay, so thank you, Stephen, very much. Please, as I said before, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A category, and I will read you one, actually from my husband, from Philip Oppenheimer. Did you factor in the number of women who died in childbirth? And I might add to that, that may tie in also to germ theory and understanding that potentially. But anyway, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are 2 things to think about. So maternal mortality is certainly factored in those numbers, right? Because you have a mother dying in childbirth is going to be dying at a relatively early age compared to the average in most cultures. And so that would drag the overall average. And as we improve maternal mortality, make childbirth safer, which is a major improvement, we increase life expectancy partly. But yeah, the germ theory part of this is very interesting. And this is actually not in the book. This is in the show. This is in the episode that's coming up on Tuesday, which is the story about Semmelweis and the origins of the germ theory, which is a story that people know a little bit, but I think there's a twist to it that maybe people don't know, which is that Semmelweis is a doctor in Vienna in the 1840s, and he's working they had two maternity wards in the Vienna hospital, and one was basically led by doctors who were delivering babies and generally catering to well-to-do women. And then there was a ward where there was just midwives, no doctors involved, and the women generally were like working class. And when Semmelweis gets on the scene, he realizes he's confronted by this terrible fact, which is the women in the kind of the fancier ward working with doctors are dying of terrible infections at a dramatic rate, much higher than the other ward. And so precisely the ward you would think would actually have better maternal mortality numbers actually is doing much, much worse. And no one can figure it out. And so Semmelweis goes in, and it's a wonderful kind of detective story. He goes through all this data trying to figure out what's going on. And he begins to realize, he starts developing this idea that there are these invisible organisms on our hands that are transmitted and touching people and bodies, later known as microbes and bacteria and potentially viruses, that no one can see. No one's identified this at this point, but he thinks they're being transmitted to these women. And he comes up with this idea that people should wash their hands before delivering babies. What he also realizes is that the main reason that the doctors are being the transmission agent here of these terrible infections is that in between delivering babies, they are going down and doing research dissecting cadavers as part of their work, whereas the midwives just deliver babies. And so Semmelweis just says to the doctors, please wash your hands before you deliver a baby. And he is roundly ignored. He shows all this data showing that it will make life much safer for the mothers, but his ideas are rejected. The doctors hate the idea that they're somehow the cause of this infection. And it takes another 10 or 15 years for this idea of hand washing in a surgical environment to become standard. It shows you how long it sometimes takes for these ideas to come. But the thing I think is just so shocking about this story is that he wasn't just asking them to wash their hands. All he was saying was, if you were going to dissect corpses, cadavers, and deliver babies in the same day, could you please wash your hands between those two activities? And even then, the doctors were resistant to the idea.
Okay. Now, from Molly Fitzmaurice, you touched on the role of refrigeration. Can you speculate on the role it could play if every remote community had refrigeration in terms of freshness of food, ability to preserve, and medications like vaccines?
It's interesting, Mary, you started off by mentioning my book, How We Got to Now. And as you might remember, there's a whole chapter in that book, and we did a whole show episode of How We Got to Now that was called Cold. And it was about how important the invention of refrigeration was to the world in just so many unintended ways. Everything from refrigeration to air conditioning, in fact. And refrigeration is one of those things where you think of it as largely about food, but in fact, it has a number of health implications, both in terms of preventing spoilage, but also, as we've seen with the COVID vaccines, that some of them require these super cold temperatures, and that's a constraint in their ability to distribute. And so, to the guest's question, yes, if we could electrify the entire world, or using solar power potentially, like have these kind of portable refrigeration units everywhere, that would be a big bonus. We're getting there. I mean, it's increasingly common that we see refrigeration and electricity all around the world. It was a crucial factor in the smallpox campaign to eradicate smallpox, because the previous vaccines had to be kept cold. And in 1975, in Bangladesh, there were lots of, small villages where, they'd never even heard of a refrigerator, much less had access to one. And so one of the key breakthroughs was not actually refrigeration, but was developing what they called a heat stable vaccine that didn't need to be refrigerated and could be distributed. And that was, I think they probably wouldn't have been able to eradicate smallpox if they hadn't come up with that technique.
Okay. All right, we have a question from Lloyd Baruti. We can expect genomics to result in significant advances in disease diagnosis and eradication in the near future. People will be made more perfect to live much longer, thus presumably increasing the population. Based on your conclusion that people living longer paradoxically has a negative effect on climate change, won't the inevitable and imminent advances in genomics make things even worse and therefore bode badly for controlling the destruction of the planet as a result of climate change? What to do about it?
It's an excellent question. So a couple things to say about it. There are some, I touch on this briefly at the end of the book. There's much more to be said about it. There are some very interesting work. There's some very interesting work being done, as you say, coming out of our understanding of genomics, but also a few other fields that really is exploring this idea that aging itself is a process that, in a sense, is like a disease, that you could treat aging itself and not the diseases associated with aging, like heart disease or dementia or cancer. And there is some evidence out there, it's very early, and there's a lot of dispute about whether this is real or not, but there's some evidence that argues that we could stop on a cellular level the process of aging itself. And that is one of the interesting things about aging, if you study this, is that people really don't age from about 20 to their early 30s. There's this period they finish developing, they've gone through this cycle of development, but they have not started aging yet. And during that period, their cells are changing over all the time, but they're not aging. So there's something in their body that is capable of replicating cells without the aging process at all. And then at some point, interestingly, after the kind of core reproductive years, we think there's an evolutionary reason for this, something gets switched on. Probably multiple things get switched on, and our cells start to age, and that leads over time to the diseases and other infirmities that come from being an old person. There's an argument that we could take that, whatever's going on in that period in your 20s, and just prolong it. And if you could do that, you're right. If you could push past that outer boundary of how long people can live, it's almost impossible to live past 110 now. Some people have lived to 120, but they're vanishingly small. So if we could somehow push past that, which a bunch of reasonable people think we could do, the strain on the planet could be immense. Now, the one way we could keep things in check is this is complicated demography here, so I don't want to get into it too far, but if you also delay the average time of reproduction, you don't have runaway population growth. So, and we're already doing that as a society. Like when in my parents' age, the average mother was 20, and now the average new mother is in their late 20s. So we're pushing back that time. If you could radically push that back, and so that if people live to 150, but they didn't have their first child until they were 50 or 60, because we've also made it easier for women of that age to continue to be able to have children, you actually wouldn't see runaway population growth because the generations kind of wouldn't stack up in that way. So if we do make that leap of radical life extension, we're either going to be in a terrible problem in terms of runaway population growth, or we're going to have to make some major adjustments in terms of the basic cycles of human life.
Yeah, because also with that, you have the issue of as people, live a very old age, they need to be cared for because they aren't, they become frail and vulnerable, et cetera. And then if you don't have the young people there, then you have all kinds of societal issues with that.
Yeah, let me say one more thing about that, Mary, which is really important. And we're hoping that we're going to do another season of the show. And one of the things I really want to explore in that is something, again, that I talk about a bit in the book, but not as much as I could have, which is the distinction between what's called lifespan and health span. And I've been talking, for the most part about lifespan, which is just how many years you get to live. But it's just as important, I think, to focus on how many of those years are you fundamentally healthy. That's what we measure when we measure health span. And part of our progress of particularly the last 20 or 30 years, is extending life at the far end, sometimes without necessarily extending health span. And so you have people who would have died at 80 before, now live to 90, but those last 5 years are really rough, and they're not in control of their destiny, and or they have Alzheimer's and they can't remember anything. And, so we want to look at both numbers. We want to make sure that we it's good to expand the average human life, but it's also good to keep people healthy for as long as you can.
Okay, so there's a question here by, not sure how to pronounce your name, Aline Nabasi, who is a member of the Rotary Club. So can you speak to the eradication of polio by Rotary and the WHO and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? We are polio free except for Pakistan and Afghanistan now.
Yeah, we're very close. It's an interesting and wonderful development. I haven't actually done any deep research into it. Polio is very close to me because my mother had polio when she was a young girl, and a couple of other. I had my grandmother's baby brother died of polio, and so it was something that impacted my family kind of directly. And then in the United States, it was gone thanks to a mass vaccination effort. And so, yeah, I think the great question about polio is, and this is true of a few other illnesses that are out there, we really, after the triumph of smallpox eradication, we really haven't managed to do something as sweeping as that since then. And I think polio is probably the place where we're closest. We in the technical terms, we've eliminated these illnesses in a lot of places, meaning in a given country it's gone, but eradication is it's gone for good from the entire world. And we know that because of smallpox, we know that we're capable of this. And the real question is, like, do we have the energy, do we have the will, do we have the commitment, do we have the resources to eradicate more? And polio, we're shockingly close. And the Gates Foundation has been amazing on this. And I think, again, just another point here about the WHO has made some missteps in this, and the CDC has probably made some missteps in this past year. But, I spent a bunch of time in the book just talking about the importance of those institutions. I mean, we could have never eradicated smallpox. We needed to invent, the smallpox vaccine, but we also needed to invent a global organization capable of coordinating activity of, hundreds of thousands of people all around the world. When the smallpox vaccine was invented, we didn't have an organization capable of doing that. And now we do. And so when we try and figure out, like, what really drives change in society, sometimes it's important to look at the material objects like a vaccine or a penicillin pill. But I think it's also important to look at the new organizational structures that we've developed that in many cases make the difference between something, eliminating smallpox locally and actually trying to do it on a global scale.
I mean, you can see, even if it's imperfect, you can see some of the aspect of a global effort with this current pandemic, where the Chinese, very early shared the genome of, of COVID, and gave a leg up really to all these other countries and scientists in trying to come up with vaccines. And so it's a little territorial. It's not quite the cooperative global effort we would like to see, but it's still, it has elements of that.
Yeah, I don't think it will surprise, the folks listening to this to hear me say this, but, we will really look back at the COVID crisis in the long run as a heroic milestone in the history of health and in the speed with which we developed these vaccines and got them distributed. And for all the tragedy, and obviously it would have been better if COVID had never happened, but the fact that we were able to do that, and that began, as you said, with the ability to sequence and share the genome. They designed what became the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. They basically designed the architecture of those mRNA vaccines without having access to a real virus. They did it just with the genetic description of it. And when I interviewed Fauci for the show, it was the day the Moderna efficacy numbers had come back, and from the third phase of the trial, and he was walking on air. He was like, "These numbers are so good, you can't believe how good they are." And in the interview, this is actually in the show, he says, if you went back in time and told me 20 years ago that we could design a vaccine without even having access to the virus, I would have said, you're insane. That doesn't even make any sense. And so the fact we were able to do that in such incredible speed is close to a miracle. I mean, it's really a tremendous leap forward in terms of the history of the science, and hopefully, a bunch more will come out of that platform.
Yeah. Well, actually, our next speaker will be speaking directly to that.
Perfect segue.
She's working with a lab up at MIT, and actually that lab, the woman who runs it got a Nobel Prize for coming up with a vaccine.
Jennifer Doudna. Yeah. She's amazing.
Yeah. So, okay, so here, how deleterious is the COVID anti-vaccine initiative? What are viable approaches to manage the apparently negative impact?
Yeah.
The anti-vax movement.
Well, this is something that I talk about in the vaccines chapter. It's an interesting thing. Anti-vax movements are as old as vaccines. There were tremendous anti-vax movements in the 19th century. That's one of the reasons why Dickens was writing so, vehemently about the importance of vaccines, is he was in a fight with people trying to make the case for vaccination. And they were probably stronger back then, in part because vaccines were not as, there was more risk associated with vaccination in the 19th century than there is in the 21st century. But there is something about the nature of vaccination as a medical intervention that has always been troubling for people, which is that you are giving someone an injection of something, often some version of the deadly virus you're worried about. You're giving that treatment to someone who is not sick in most cases. And it's often a child, your child. And so unlike other situations where your child is sick and you go to the doctor and say, hey, how can you treat my child is sick? In this case, you have a perfectly healthy child and you're doing this procedure. And so that has just always been this major conceptual block. And it's why vaccines are just categorically different in terms of resistance in the general population compared to almost every other medical treatment that's out there. And so that's always going to be there. To me, I mean, I think that the messaging we are seeing now from institutions like the CDC and from the White House about the positive benefits of vaccination, i.e., hey, you can stop wearing your mask if you're vaccinated. Hey, you can do this with, that there was a period of time where it felt like they were a little bit too conservative in terms of selling the benefits. And I think a switch has been flipped, in part because overall kind of ambient COVID in the population has gone down since where it was in February and March. There's a market change, and now it's really a message about the good side effects of getting vaccinated and all the freedom and return to normalcy you're going to have if you do that. That's important. And frankly, I mean, I hope that if you watch the vaccines episode, the images of smallpox victims, it's a terrifying disease, and to look at that and say, hey, that used to be the life, that could have been my kid, but for vaccines. I think if we teach this history and we remind ourselves of what the kind of the freedom from particularly childhood death that vaccines have given us, hopefully that will also change people's attitudes.
Okay, let's see. William White asks, what about the role each person takes in the task of their own good health and the quality of food they are provided?
Yeah, well, food is a big thing. Actually, it's one of the things that I would like. There's the final chapter in the book, or the penultimate chapter in the book, is about food, and which is really measured in the decline of famine, which is a wonderful story of progress, particularly over the last 30 years. But if you'd gone back to 1920, when there were 2 billion people on the planet, and said, looked around at just the number of epic famines that were happening at that point in Persia and India and the newly formed Soviet Union, you just had terrible problems with people not getting enough food to just survive, with millions of people dying in famines. If you said to somebody in 1920, hey, there can be 4 times as many people on the planet, they would say, well, that's going to be a complete disaster. We'll never have enough food. We don't have enough food to feed 2 billion. And so the revolution in basically productivity, initially agrarian productivity, and then the development understandably controversial development of things like factory farming and the number of chickens we have in the world, but artificial fertilizer and the green revolution and all these things that have happened, we have really taken famine from a major mortality threat where it was 100 years ago to something that almost never happens on a mass level. And that is an extraordinary breakthrough. What it means in terms of, your own diet, that's a whole other issue. It's obviously when we've looked at cultures around the world that seem to be unusually long-lived, we definitely see there's changes. They tend to not eat a lot of meat. They tend to not eat a lot of food overall. They tend to have reduced caloric intake. They're not starving, but they don't kind of overeat. And so there's a lot to learn from the study of nutrition for sure, and understanding how to live longer.
Okay, here, this is a little bit different kind of question from Dave Marshall. I'm in Seattle and currently teaching a 10th grade global health class. Your show has been such a brilliant resource. Thank you. What advice do you have for teenagers considering a career in history, writing, or global health?
That's great. I'm so glad to hear it. I should mention that the Pulitzer Center has developed these education materials for the show and for the New York Times Magazine excerpt that we did, and also would support the book. So if other folks are out there interested in teaching this or getting this into their schools, if you go to pulitzercenter.org, they have resources there. I hope that that these kinds of stories do inspire people to both to go into the world of public health and medicine and solve these problems, but also to write about it and to get these ideas in circulation. I think that there are wonderful stories. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of narrative in getting people to understand these things and getting people mobilized and getting people vaccinated. And what I find as a writer, as a storyteller on TV is, and I've alluded to this a little bit, I mentioned it in the Semmelweis things and the Ghost Map, that a lot of these stories are fundamentally kind of mysteries, right? They are about someone approaching a problem, trying to figure it out. There are these clues, they can't figure out what's causing it, and by thinking it through and putting the clues together, they solve it in this way. And I think when you're in the classroom and you're trying to get otherwise bored 15-year-old energized and excited about science, that teaching it in that narrative mode where you're like, okay, here are the clues, let's try and piece it together, or this is what this person did in the past, that there's something really once you get hooked on that storyline, you get pulled into it. So I think that as a teaching mechanism, I think that can be very powerful.
Great. I just, I guess, a personal question is, in the research and talking to professionals in this field, you read a lot about drug-resistant bacteria. Is great progress being made in dealing with that now? I mean, that's a scary scenario that may set us going in a reverse direction. Yeah,
there's not enough progress as there needs to be. If people are interested in this, I just did a wonderful interview with an expert on antibiotic resistance in bacteria. And it's on, if you go to medium.com and search for the title of the piece is "Resistance is Inevitable" instead of "Resistance is Futile." And there's an interesting conversation with this expert from McMaster University, Jerry Wright. The biggest problem is that we are not developing new antibiotics. We really haven't developed new antibiotics in the last couple of decades. It's not a profit center for private pharmaceutical companies. They want to manufacture drugs, understandably, given that they're private companies. That people, an anti-cholesterol drug that you'll start taking when you're 50 and take for the next 40 years, whereas here's this antibiotic that you'll take for 12 days and then you're cured. That the economics of that aren't nearly as good. And developing new antibiotics is tricky. Most of the low-hanging fruit has been discovered. And unlike something for heart disease or high cholesterol or whatever it is, the bacteria are evolving at such incredible speed. I mean, their replication time is, our replication time is 25 years. Bacteria's replication time is measured in seconds or minutes, right? And so if we don't update the antibiotics, the bacteria are constantly experimenting, just like the variants with COVID. The bacteria are constantly experimenting with new ways to be alive in the world. And if some of those evade older antibiotics, those are the ways that are going to survive and prosper. That's just the laws of evolution. And so we're in a race against bacterial evolution, effectively. And so we probably need a non-market solution to this. It probably, or at least a public-private collaboration. And there's a couple of big initiatives. I think the Wellcome Trust is funding, trying to figure out how to develop these new antibiotics, because it's something we need to really focus on.
All right, thanks. So, we're almost up to 9 o'clock. Is there anything else that you want to say, or, any area that we haven't touched on that you think our audience would be interested in before we say goodnight?
Well, I guess I'll just mention that, we mentioned at the top that, one of the nice advantages of coming out with a book every year, which I've been doing now for the last couple of years, is that the paperback of the last book comes out with your new book. And so the book I wrote last year, which is a completely different story, but it's a lot of fun, and it's a great Father's Day present, by the way. I just like to it's a story about a pirate, a true story about a pirate in the 1700s, in the late 1600s, named Henry Avery, who pulls off this heist of a Indian treasure ship coming back from Mecca, and triggers a massive global conflict that leads to the first kind of global manhunt in history. He's basically the Osama bin Laden of the late 17th century. And it's a really fun story. Like all my books, it goes off in these different directions, and you learn about the birth of the East India Company and modern capitalism and the history of the Muslim regime in India and the politics of life on board a pirate ship. But someday it will be a really great movie. I hope someone will make it. It'll be expensive to make, but it's a fun story. So if people are visiting Oblong Books, that's a great one to pick up as well.
Well, my husband and I listened to it when we were driving. It's a very good audio book.
Okay, good.
And, it is an interesting story. And I mean, I just am so amazed by your career, because you just, cover so many different topics. And, I can imagine it's really fun to learn about all these different, just delve into these different things in depth. So, well, I guess that's it for tonight. I want to thank Stephen Johnson so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to spend the last, hour and a half with you. And so I hope everyone enjoys their weekend. Coming up, I'm used to doing this on Friday night, so it seems like it should be a Friday night. But anyway, I hope the rest of the week goes well, and you have a great Memorial Day holiday. So thank you again, Stephen. It's just been terrific.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoyed it.